So I'm here with Jack Barton, who's first of all my brother, but also a good collaborator and someone whose work I admire a real lot. He featured on the channel a while back with Feedback Study and also completed a section for the anthology film Pending, while his music has also been across a couple of other bits on the channel. So Jack, could you just tell us a little bit about your work and your background?
So I've been working on audiovisual composition for the last year or so. I started becoming involved in this in my master's course, and it's sort of been an application of various sound design processes that I've been working on over the last few years across several different media. As a composer, I've been working in theatre and film and dance and several other mediums, collaborating with many wonderful people. And I think I've always found it really crucial to my ability to create and generate new forms, to be able to use some sort of other medium as a counterpoint to sonic creation. So it felt quite natural to me when I started discovering video synthesis to explore this as a means to generate new sonic ideas and to pair these two things together, essentially, and to explore different sorts of motion.
Well, this touched on a bunch of things that I think about Feedback Study. It ties in with the very last thing you said, which was motion, which is something I felt really epitomized what Feedback Study was to me. And I was wondering if you kind of still got this feeling with it as well, and if how this tied in with your process of it.
Yeah, I think it's one of the really unique aspects of working with these two mediums together. And I think working with visual material in this abstracted sense, where uh, I'm just trying to think about different sorts of motion, like you say, and I think there's an inherent link between the sort of trajectories you can experience with in this visual material and different sort of sonic qualities. I think part of the task in this sort of composition is trying to create a vocabulary, essentially, in which you can marry these two uh, aspects and try and create something which seems like a compelling audiovisual object, essentially. Trying to pair different sorts of motion together in a compelling way, I think, is really central to creating compelling audiovisual objects. And it's part of what's so fascinating, I think, also to explore all the different varieties of this counterpoint, essentially, in creating a multi-sensory experience that sort of transcends what you can simply achieve using sound alone or video alone.
Could you tell us a little bit about, well, maybe take us through the process of how you made this? Like, what were the tools that you used to make the visuals, and what were the tools you made to use the audio, and how did they interact throughout that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So I discovered about a year ago now there's a software application called Max, which I've been using for some years for audio processing, um, and a developer called Kevin Cripper has built a set of tools in which you can essentially imitate the process of analog video synthesis inside this engine. And so there's a modular aspect to these different tools. You have different modules which generate different sorts of video signal, most of which are based on video waveforms. So there's some analog to audio synthesis, and then various other modules which you can transform the video through. And basically, I fell into this world quite deeply about a year ago, and begun by making various patches which I would use then for still images, actually. But I think immediately playing around with this technology, I felt there's a lot of potential for realizing different sorts of motion and realizing different sorts of quite very abstract forms as well, which somehow lend themselves to this abstract sonic expression quite well, I think. For the feedback study that was shown on Cinema Not Cinema, the process that I've been using is still slightly unlinked in the sense that the video creation and the audio creation are separate entities. So I spent some time developing patches using VSynth and exploring what different visual material I could create, and perhaps it's coming up with a palette of material, which then I would record at some length and then edit down into smaller sections. And for the feedback study, this involved sort of creating a visual structure first, And then after finishing that, I sort of brought it away and maybe have some time to mull it over and think about it, and then just started to compose sound over that afterwards. So there's a sort of preliminary process in which I create this initial visual object, and then sort of start to apply different sound processes to that. A lot of the sound that I generated for this study, I used a process called granular synthesis, which is a sort of sampling process, a digital sampling process, in which a piece of audio is deconstructed into small segments of itself, and then you can reconstitute audio signals using that. So it's a form of synthesis which uses audio playback as its parameter. But I found this was quite a good method for creating these sort of textural effects, essentially, for some of the, especially in the second half of the study, with these large field-based motion. I kind of wanted to explore the comparison between different sorts of texture through using that.
They're interesting processes to me because I don't know much about synthesis myself, and it's something that's kind of interesting about the way that you're describing using these different syntheses, I guess, and processes which derive from analog technologies but have been kind of simulated in a digital environment, and the way you're talking about them is using them digitally, right? I was wondering what your relationship between those two was, if you had much experience doing similar things with analog technologies, or if you'd like to, if you hadn't, and how you think that might affect the process and affect the outcomes that you'd get to.
Actually, I haven't had a chance to experiment much with analog video synthesis yet, and it's something that I'd be very keen to do. I've spent quite a lot of time with analog audio synthesis. I mean, there are many different ways in which these two technologies sort of exist in opposition to each other in what they can offer and what their capabilities are. And I think part of utilizing either of them successfully is trying to understand the strengths or the capabilities, I guess, that are inherent in either of them. So some of the possibilities in analog synthesis, such as this sort of continuous gradation between parameters, which aren't possible with digital technology because of the fact that every stepwise motion that you make, say, in a given parameter, is one increment in a numerical scale. This is something that can yield some very beautiful and complex results visually. I've seen there are quite a few video artists who explore this, particularly with video feedback, to create some really interesting things. There's a New York-based artist, Andre J, who creates some fantastic video feedback works using analog TV sets and video mixes, which he built himself to create feedback loops. And they're some very detailed. There's some great detail you can achieve with that is more difficult to achieve with the digital technology. But on the other hand, there's a sort of level of control and precision that you can achieve with digital synthesis, which is very difficult to replicate with analog technology. And I think particularly when using video feedback, there's something that's quite desirable in that it's a very chaotic process inherently. And part of what's quite interesting about exploring it is that you end up, it can offer all these possibilities which are quite unexpected as you're exploring different patches. But I think to be able to have some element of control over that in the compositional process has been really useful to me. And it actually, at the moment, I'm working on developing a generative system with this, and being able to control these parameters with some precision is incredibly useful.
All the experience I have had, pretty much all the experience, has been through a digital interface. But the times I have used kind of more analog interfaces, I've remembered them a lot more as being much more exciting for me to use, much more, I don't know, there's just a feel and a texture about it that the kind of like haptics of touching an interface and turning a knob and then seeing or hearing this kind of result that brings in for me. I suppose this is for me being outside of the field. I don't know, do you enjoy the analog process for that? Because that's often why it's like fetishized, that it's touching and it's like being with the work rather than being on a digital interface where you're turning digital knobs and you're using your mouse. And
there's definitely an aspect of that. I think undoubtedly it's something that I think draws a lot of people towards analog technology is having this haptic interface essentially, and being able to directly interface with a sound object or a video object in this way. But I think what really opened up the value of these digital technologies as well to me is being able to sort of navigate that the whole aspect of interface design oneself as well, and to start on a sort of quite free and much higher level, be able to construct interfaces essentially, and really think about interface design and parameter design, and how to remap and construct your own interfaces essentially. I think it's still quite possible to have this very direct physical connection with digital tools, and maybe in some ways I feel that I'm quite drawn to digital technology anyway, because it's been the mainstay of my my creations in music for most of my life. I guess I think, like most people in my generation, I've spent a lot of time working with a computer, and this has become a very natural workflow for me. So I think in some way finding ways to bridge that gap between having some very real interface that you can connect with on a physical level, but then also being able to have this precision and it's just the flexibility and dexterity of digital systems is sort of being able to meet in the middle in that way. I think has found a really good process for me.
Yeah, and I think this is definitely something I feel for film and video and cinema as well. This disconnect between digital and analog for me, because I have had a little experience of working with celluloid film and developing and whatever, both for photographs and for 16mm. But I don't know, there is this connection I do feel to the digital image, and using digital workstations and recording digitally and using video cameras instead of film cameras. And there is some kind of preference to that. And then all these artifacts and all these weird ways you can kind of mold those through data instead of through touch and physically damaging the film or whatever. But I suppose one thing that daunts me about a lot of those processes, and daunts a lot of people, I think our generation, even though we're very experienced with using computers, is the need to know how to either code or understand kind of computer languages. And I was wondering what your experience with that is getting into this, and if a lot of that is really necessary.
I think that's what's been really fantastic for me about Max as an intermediary tool into that world. I think Max has opened up some of the possibilities and at least the questions of creative coding as a practice towards music and to some extent towards video as well. But I'm not a coder. My understanding of coding is limited to some extent, and I think being able to use a technology like this, which can provide essentially an interface in which you can start engaging very directly with things like modularity and parameter control, and being able to analyze different signals and then route data essentially to different controls without having to be able to code in text, I think is a really fantastic thing. And there, I mean, these worlds sort of exist with analog modular synthesis anyway, and with analog video synthesis. I guess it's the same sort of principles, but I think being able to use these tools in the digital realm to give you access to those sort of modes of thinking have really changed the way that I think about composition, I think, in a lot of ways. I think also linked to this idea of trying to create a coherent audiovisual object, I think I've explored audiovisual composition from the point of just literally just taking footage and then composing with instruments or with other tools on the computer, but as a very fractured process. I think more and more my practice is sort of coming to a point in which I'm trying to get the computer to speak to itself essentially with these two, to take these 2 points of data, or these 2 streams, the audio and the visual, and to really connect them in a way that the parameters are fusing to create an object in.
Yeah, well, that kind of brings us back to feedback study and this kind of practicing more in general. You talked about specifically with this one, and kind of suggested generally that you use this as your practice of kind of making a visual object and then responding to it. So I was wondering if your process for these kind of objects that you've worked, these kind of audiovisual studies, if this has always been your process and of doing visual first and then audio, or if you've worked the other way around, or if you'd like to kind of enter some new way of working with that through, you mentioned working on something generative at the minute, which maybe marries the two a little more closely in the process of creation.
Yeah, well, I think the former process of generating video first and then responding to it, I think came quite naturally to me after spending some time collaborating in different mediums. I think I've always found it quite compelling to have some clear intention, essentially, in which it can respond to sonically. So, in the place of perhaps working on a theatre production or working alongside a collaborator in film, working with you on some of your short films, and having some material like that to respond to in some way, I think it felt quite natural to me to take some material to use as a starting point. I think it can be really interesting when you sort of translate media in this way, because you can end up exploring form particularly, but I mean any sort of mode of expression within sound essentially, but temporal form especially. I think it can be really interesting to see how you can adopt very unusual or unorthodox modes of shaping a composition based on responding to an image in space and time. I think this is why video works so well inherently. I mean, there's a shared dimension in which is why we talk about motion as well, in the sense that it's trying to marry these different trajectories with each other. But yeah, more and more, I think trying to bring these things together and have a process in which I can create the two simultaneously is starting to become something that is quite exciting. So currently I'm working on a generative project in which there's some paired control between the audio and the visual. I think like I was mentioned about these feedback processes, I think the interesting thing is that sometimes the video will generate patterns and emotion which is quite unexpected, and so to have some feedback in the system in itself, in that perhaps there's some master control which is creating video and audio events concurrently, but then also I have various analyzing tools looking at the motion of the video and what different shapes are being created, and that information can then feed back into the audio generation as well. So there's this sort of multi-layered process in which there's perhaps some master control, and the sound is influencing the way that the visual is generated, but then also the patterns that come out of the feedback will be creating changes in the audio as well. And I think having that process linked together somehow creates a much more compelling result in some ways. And it's also quite exciting to see the places in which it can sort of arrive at of its own accord somehow.
Yeah, well, this is something we've talked about quite a lot in the past as well, about this kind of generative process, which could somewhat be controlled by, well, either by a knowing like person manipulating the video or the audio, or just being a reactive process. And how all of this links to a lot of live performance, I think is quite interesting, because lives is a concept which is quite alien to lots of cinema and to film and video as a medium, because it's kind of inherently not live, right? And generative video is kind of where this bridges the gap, be that generative in some computing sense or generative in just a way of recording something and then screening it live. But this idea of live brings me back to the thought of music a lot, because, I mean, music fundamentally is a live medium. And I was wondering if this interest in making live visuals, you think, comes from that kind of inherent liveness in music. And because obviously your first love is music here, and then you're bringing visuals into the music. So I was wondering how that kind of interacted for you.
Yeah, I think definitely there's an aspect of liveness that attracted me to this. I think video synthesis as well has a really large place in live music, particularly in electronic music, within this mode of performance as a sort of an enhancement or just a marrying of another medium onto this mode of expression. And I think definitely this is one of the things that first attracted me to exploring all of this. I think there are so many possibilities for this mode of expression and how it can be incorporated into even live instrumental performance. I think there's definitely some explorations down the line that I'd really like to open up into how these sort of video systems can be applied to a live band performance, for example, using things like pitch or amplitude tracking of various instruments to control different parameters of a video synthesizer for live performance. And I think, yeah, there's a whole world of it to be explored.
Well, I'm also interested how you kind of arrived at this. Obviously, you studied music, and this is kind of your where you arrive at it from through music. But are there any particular works, or maybe it's going to live performances and seeing these kind of systems, or I don't know. I was wondering, yeah, how you arrived at this kind of audiovisual mix.
There are definitely some crucial inspirations that I had at various points, which really attracted me to this as a really compelling mode of expression. Someone who has done a lot of work in the audiovisual field is Ryoji Ikeda. I went to see his Datamatics at the Barbican a couple of years ago, and was just absolutely astounded by the immersive extent of this work, and also the extent to which information, this sort of abstract pattern information, could be transmitted at such fidelity. It's an incredible demonstration of the power of the marriage of visual and auditory mediums in order to sort of convey pattern information. I think seeing how overwhelming this experience can be on a sensory level, I think really made me feel that there's or just the power of this additional dimension, essentially, to convey this meaning somehow. Another audiovisual composer who I've been really fond of is Joseph Hyde, who there's a work of his, Vanishing Point, which explores the relationship of noise and silence in the audiovisual medium, and how both can be represented visually and in sound. Basically creating a topology of noise and silence between this idea of noise being a maximal rate of change and silence being maximal similarity. And again, just the sort of additional layer of expression that can be added through combining these two forms. In counterpoint, I think it's quite similar. You sort of get drawn into, obviously, the territory of film scoring and different means in which sound can be applied to narrative film as well, in terms of effect. All these different questions, like how juxtaposition can work to create different effect, which sort of layers of the image you're focusing on and you want to draw attention to somehow. It's just, I think there's a dialogue that exists there, which is, it somehow creates, it's larger than the two things individually. There's an additional layer of meaning in their relationship between the two, which is really interesting to me.